Welcome to the World War II Discussion Forums Fall Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method you choose, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 15 or 20 minutes of questions and end promptly at 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated but never expected. Please note there is a donate tab on the website. Third, as I alluded to at the beginning, we do have a YouTube channel and we'll be recording this talk for that. It should be posted shortly thereafter. Please see the icon at the top of the website to access the YouTube channel. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker. Peter Hayes is Theodore Zev Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation Professor Emeritus at Northwestern University. He is the author of the best-selling Why? Explaining the Holocaust, as well as 13 other books and more than 100 articles and chapters on the history of the Nazi era. Professor Hayes served for 20 years on the academic committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and as its chair from 2014 to 2019. This afternoon, Peter will speak on his most recent book, Profits and Persecution, German Big Business in the Nazi Economy and the Holocaust, which unites business history and the history of the Holocaust to consider both the economic and personal motivations that rendered German corporate leaders complicit in the actions of the Nazi parties. The reviews have been solid, particularly from the New York Times and the Telegraph. I do want to read one from Christopher Browning, author of Nazi Policy, Jewish Workers, German Killers. In a masterful synthesis of current scholarship, Peter Hayes shows how the German business community cooperated with the Nazi regime for multiple reasons, partially overlapping political values, a near total absence of anti-Semitic sentiments, but above all, the perceived need not to be outdone by economic rivals in the race for profit, spoils, and government favor. Within the framework of Germany's directed economy, the business community became increasingly complicit in the atrocities of the Nazi regime, including ultimately the despoiling of the Jews, the lethal exploitation of forced and slave labor, and genocide. As Hayes concludes, when the German business community faced Nazism's corrupting mix of compulsion and temptation, controls and opportunity, then sadly, rational calculation served Nazi criminality. With that, I'm thrilled to have Peter, and I will turn it over to him.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and for your interest in this topic. Historians often stress the open-endedness of the stories they tell, the contingency of events that could have gone in multiple directions had the people taking part made different choices. In a sense, my remarks today both conform to this sort of narrative and depart from it. Without questioning the general principle of indeterminacy, I want to suggest that the key switches were thrown very early in the development of German corporate collaboration in the persecution and murder of the Jews. Probably in the first 6 months of Nazi rule, surely in the first 18 months, and well before the regime's principal policymakers had decided what that collaboration would require. Barring a change in the erratic but inexorable momentum of Nazi government policy toward ever greater viciousness, these switches became irreversible. After putting up an only half-hearted and self-serving defense of some German Jews, while many others were losing positions and property during the initial months of Nazi rule, the leaders of the nation's largest corporations simply had no persuasive, let alone safe grounds to dissent later. As the Reich's policies radicalized, firms discerned ever-mounting reasons to take advantage of developments. In other words, the slippery slope started fast and proved steep. In view of the 2024 election results in the US, this is a timely, worrying, and potentially instructive story. The slope tipped downward even before Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. Since a fateful ambivalence regarding anti-Semitism already pervaded the upper reaches of Germany's largest corporations. On the one hand, unlike many fervent Nazis, few executives resented Jews as economic competitors, or considered the commanding heights of the German economy verjudet, Jewified. The numerical presence of Jews on the managing and supervisory boards of the country's 90 most highly capitalized firms had dropped by almost one-third between 1907 and 1927. On the boards of the 300 largest non-financial firms in Germany, that presence fell by almost another third during the following 5 years. By 1932, almost two-thirds of these 300 leading firms had no Jews in senior positions. Multiple causes accounted for the downward trend. Mortality among senior industrialists with no suitable heirs or Jewish successors, mismanagement by some unsuitable progeny, mergers in the late 1920s that absorbed many Jewish-owned firms into publicly traded entities, resignations during the upheaval of the Depression, and government decrees that shrank the size of corporate boards and the number on which any individual could serve. Anti-Semitism appears to have played a role in only one significant case, that of the disappearance of Jews from the managing board of the chemical giant IG Farben between 1925 and 1932, but not in others. After all, many of the remaining Jews were that by heritage only and second or third generation converts to Christianity. Few were regarded as alien in any significant sense, and virtually none took political positions significantly different from those of their non-Jewish colleagues. Most contemporary or retrospective accounts suggest that anti-Semitism did not quite stop at the boardroom doors, but its grasp was relatively weak inside the threshold. Nonetheless, a particular mix of anti-Semitic aversions persisted among corporate leaders. It thrived not on animosity or rivalry toward Jews one knew, but on distaste for those perceived from a distance. Two such groups aroused particular ire. First, the roughly 100,000 traditionalist Jews from Eastern Europe, many of whom had immigrated during a period of lax border controls during and shortly after World War I. They now constituted 20% of the German Jewish population. They appeared uninterested in assimilation, and they aroused fears of incursion by the backward and unwashed East. Second, the numerous Jewish intellectuals who criticized capitalism from prominent positions in culture and journalism, and thus offended industrialists' self-esteem. The three examples I've here picked are Ernst Toller, who was a famous German writer in the early 1920s and also an important figure in the revolutionary events of 1918-1919, Max Reinhardt, the most famous theater director in Germany, in Berlin, and Theodor Wolff, the editor of the center-left Berliner Tageblatt, also based in Berlin. Uneasy with attacks on decent and accomplished Jews like themselves, but irritated by these other Jews, many corporate leaders gravitated toward a specious middle ground in policy, a fateful ambivalence typified by the diaries and papers of Fritz Rössler, the man you see here on the left. He was the supervisory board chairman at Degussa, a major inorganic chemicals firm in Frankfurt, whose successor nowadays is known as Evonik. Rössler expressed opposition to infringements on the livelihood and legal status of long-resident Jewish fellow citizens, but also expressed support for measures that would, as he put it, quote, push back, unquote, Jews' cultural influence, including by imposing quotas on their admission to universities and professional schools, the so-called numerus clausus. Hitler, Goering, and other leading Nazis indulged this drawing of distinctions prior to 1933 by echoing it or avoiding the subject of Jews altogether when meeting with big business leaders, even as Nazi newspapers and marauding stormtroopers threatened a much more sweeping attack. As a result, when Hitler came to power, most of the leaders of German big business underestimated the threat Nazi anti-Semitism posed to Jews, but already had ruled out a categorical defense of them. The fateful consequence of this weakness of anti-Semitism at the top of the corporate world became apparent swiftly during the spring of 1933, as the Nazi movement demonstrated its lack of deference to the nation's magnates and their scruples. At a gathering of some 24 high-ranking executives on February 20th in Berlin, to which Hermann Göring had attracted them with a promise that, quote, the Reich Chancellor will explain his policies, unquote, Hitler made clear that he was not interested in discussing economic issues, but rather in shaking down those assembled for monetary contributions to his current election campaign. The Nazis' method was to announce that they had no intention of relinquishing power regardless of the outcome of the voting. So the industrialist choice was between financing Hitler's win or experiencing civil war if he lost. Hitler and Goering then departed, leaving Hjalmar Schacht, he's the man on the right here of the screen, a former and future head of the German National Bank, to collect their pledges, which amounted to 3 million marks. 2 weeks later, the Nazis manipulated the ground rules and won 44% of the vote, and their nationalist allies another 8%. Their qualified victory set off numerous wildcat actions by Nazi party zealots in factories across the countries, as non-Nazi workers' representatives were compelled to resign in favor of politically acceptable figures, and pressure mounted on companies to dismiss Jewish managers, reduce the numbers of Jewish employees, and replace them with unemployed Nazi Party members. This sort of agitation culminated in early April 1933, during and following the infamous party-organized boycott of Jewish shops and offices. Often overlooked is another event that occurred on that same day, the appearance of Otto Wagner, the man you see here on the left, at the time the leader of the Nazi Party's Economic Policy Office, at the offices of the National Association of German Industry. Wagner demanded the dismissal of 2 of the organization's business managers, their replacement by 2 government-approved appointees, and the removal of all Jews from its governing board. As it happened, the association's president, the man here in the middle, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, was meeting at that very moment with Hitler. And when he learned later that day of the demands, he entreated the Führer to rescind them. After Hitler said no 2 days later, Krupp caved in over the protests of several other board members, whom he silenced by threatening to resign. This was the first fateful turning point, as German big business capitulated to an entirely extra-legal demand, backed only by naked political power, and it occurred only 2 months after Hitler came into office. Thereafter, Krupp clung to what one historian has called a strategy of ingratiation. I prefer the word appeasement, hoping to maintain industry's influence over the government economic policies by cooperating with the regime's political goals. Most of German big business fell in line between this ultimately futile policy because they could not agree on an alternative and because they liked other Nazi policies, such as the smashing of the trade unions. But both lack of conviction about defending Jews and fear of personal consequences contributed to the inertia. The mixed feelings that many executives harbored toward Jews meant that the most they could expect from the corporate world, at least in public, was the sort of temporizing defense that Carl Friedrich von Siemens, the man on the right in this set, who is the head of the firm, the electrical firm that bore his family name, the kind of temporizing defense that he offered in early April. He expressed, quote, the sincerest sympathy to the German Jews who are deeply rooted in our fatherland, and the hope that this period of exaggerated anti-Semitism will soon belong to history, unquote. But Siemens also endorsed the arrest of edel Bolschewisten, a term that roughly means cultured communists, including what he said was, quote, a very large percentage of Jews, primarily newly immigrated ones, unquote. He then chided native-born German Jews for having failed to distance themselves sufficiently from the leftist politics of what he called their racial comrades, unquote, ihre Rassengenossen, and advocated the reduction of the share of Jews among lawyers and physicians, quote, to a healthy proportion that approximates the population mix, unquote. In person, as late as May 1933, a few executives, notably Karl Bosch on IG Farben, of IG Farben here on the left, and Hans Walz of the Robert Bosch Corporation on the right, tried to persuade Hitler and other leading Nazis that persecuting Jews would damage Germany, but to no avail. A behind-the-scenes effort from May to August to draft a memo for the economics ministry to the same effect, in which Karl Bosch, Krupp, and Siemens took part, resulted in a WAN document that endorsed the goal, quote, of bringing the views of the national government to fulfillment, unquote, but argued for proceeding slowly and avoiding economic disruption. The toothless text quickly became a dead letter. The second secret behind the general acceptance of Krupp's policy was the regime's intimidation of several highly visible corporate leaders during the spring of 1933. Paul Reusch, the man there on the left, the head of a mining and machinery conglomerate, and a dominant voice among German industrialists in the waning days of the Weimar Republic, owned a newspaper in Munich that the Nazis wished to control. Between March and May of 1933, Nazi officials dismissed the editors and appointed new ones, confiscated Reusch's stockholding, and arrested his protesting lawyers, making their release conditional upon acceptance of the expropriation. Reusch not only gave in, but henceforth lined up behind Krupp's course, which he had opposed initially. Simultaneously, two other magnates, Philipp Reimsma, the man here in the middle, the head and part owner of Germany's largest producer of cigarettes, and Günther Quandt, the man here on the right, who had the same status in the leading producer of batteries, found themselves being investigated by the Prussian Justice Ministry for alleged instances of corruption and bribery during the Weimar Republic. Reimsma avoided arrest, but several of his leading managers did not, and he was subjected to attacks in the press and calls for his removal that came to an end only when he paid Hermann Göring a bribe of 3 million marks. Quandt's torture lasted longer and cost more. He and his chief subordinates were arrested, and a Nazi commissar took over his plants for several months. Quandt obtained his release only by paying a bail that came, according to a headline in the New York Times, to over $1 million US. He remained embroiled in expensive legal proceedings for another 2 years. Meanwhile, having gotten the intended message, both Reimsma and Quandt aligned themselves closely with the regime's policies, and Quandt became particularly active in driving Jews out of German economic positions. By the summer of 1933, in other words, the Nazi regime had shown Germany's corporate bigwigs who was horse and who was rider, as the German expression goes. The administration of this lesson involved passing threats to executives like Reusch, Reimsma, and Quandt, but lasting consequences for many Jewish owners. Jewish owners, firm owners, board members, managers, and even rank and file employees. They fell victim to a massive first purge that their Gentile colleagues saw as merely the price of a working relationship with the new regime. In the country's 300 leading industrial firms, 1/3 of the remaining Jewish managing directors and 1/4 of the supervisory directors, as of January 1933, lost their jobs in the first half of that year alone. By mid-1934, the respective figures came to 57% and 50%. And for firms that had their headquarters in Berlin, the respective figures were almost 2/3 and more than 1/2. Changes of ownership were less extensive at this early stage, but still significant, especially in commercial fields on which the Nazis long had fixated. For example, department and chain stores, newspapers and book publishing, state-owned industries and utilities, and suppliers to the military, government offices, and the National Railroad. Both with respect to directorships and ownerships, some major firms acted even before the regime applied pressure, exercising what the Germans call anticipatory obedience. The Deutsche Bank quickly dismissed 2 Jewish managing board members, even though Schacht told their colleagues that this was not necessary. The Dresdner Bank hired Erich Niemann, one of Hermann Goering's flying mates during World War I, to cajole the Jewish owners of firms tied to the bank to sell out before they lost value. In other words, from the beginning of Nazi rule, most leading German executives regarded the Nazi onslaught on the Jews strictly through the lens of personal and corporate self-interest. If individual managers or clients or suppliers were vital, firms tried to retain them as long as this was the case. If they were expendable, then one accepted what were called, quote, the requirements of the prevailing conditions, unquote, and extended at most help in finding jobs abroad, positive letters of recommendation, normal severance terms, and purchase prices that corresponded to the market value of what was acquired. But that value usually had been reduced, at first by the after effects of the Depression, and later by the increasing desperation of the sellers. Because the induced flight of Jewish property owners presented German big business with numerous opportunities to shelter rising profits, expand market shares, diversify and vertically or horizontally integrate their operations, the competition to cash in on Jews' misfortune picked up steadily. By 1937, niceties were falling away as regional Nazi economic advisors increasingly prompted sales and influenced prices. And banks and creditors shifted from fearing the loss of Jewish owners' expertise to fearing their loss of business and thus their ability to repay loans. Lenders thus tipped from being sustainers of Jewish enterprises to underminers of them. Meanwhile, firms began to take advantage of provisions that allowed them to reduce Jews' pension payments. The now defunct Dresdner Bank emerged as a pacesetter in brokering property transfers and reneging on its commitments to former Jewish employees, who numbered in the hundreds. The self-interest in persecution operated particularly powerfully within the macroeconomic context that Nazism created. Purging and dispossessing Jews wasn't just about gaining what they had, but also about pleasing the regime. In the second half of the 1930s, 2/3 of the annual growth in the German economy stemmed from state expenditures on armaments or import substitutes. The nation was a monopsony, an economy dominated by one buyer. And the German corporate world was dependent on and addicted to government contracts. Increasingly, A precondition for receiving those contracts was active cooperation in making Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. At the turn of 1937-38, the Nazi regime changed its policy from encouraging the removal of Jews from German economic life to enforcing it. The economics ministry issued a series of decrees withdrawing access to raw materials, foreign exchange, and government contracts from any firm with a single Jewish board member or senior manager, or in which Jews owned more than 25% of the stock. Since these decrees meant the death of any firm that met the criteria, the decrees set in motion a complete purge of the few Jews remaining in board positions and a massive sell-off of Jewish shareholdings at increasingly party-dictated prices. The Nazi state conducted a census of Jews' assets in April 1938, and in the aftermath of the Kristallnacht pogrom of November, began insisting upon the monetization of those assets, their consolidation in bank accounts to which the owners had limited access, and then partial confiscation of the amounts. Corporations now became even more active and indispensable agents of persecution than previously. The major insurance firms paid the cash value of Jews' life insurance policies into those partially blocked accounts. And Eduard Hilgard, the man you see here on the left, the head of the Allianz, the largest of these insurance firms, persuaded Nazi leaders that his company did not need to pay some 50 million Reichsmarks in Jews' fire and damage claims from the destruction during the pogrom, by making the factually outrageous but politically convenient claim that the Jews had provoked the destruction. Degussa converted the precious metals bearing objects that Jews had to hand in to the state pawn shops into bars of gold for the German National Bank and into bars of silver for industrial use. Meanwhile, the Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbanks loaned much of the capital needed to take over Jewish-owned firms and took in fees for brokering these deals. And the same financial institutions collected, itemized, and administered Jews' assets, restricted Jews' access to them, and then transferred the sums exacted by the Nazi state to the German finance ministry. Indicative of the degree to which corporate leaders and their firms had become constituent parts of the apparatus of persecution by early 1939 is the fact that of the activities I've just described, only Hilgard's was highly profitable. Even the brokering of property transfers turned out to be a low-margin business for banks because more assets were lost through the mass liquidation of Jewish-owned firms than were gained on a small number of high-commission sales. But companies and banks felt compelled to compete, not only for the assets that the regime threw up for grabs, but sometimes primarily for political favor and the future preference and rewards that it might bring. What historian Neil Gregor has called the normalization of barbarism among corporate policymakers became especially apparent regarding Jews' assets in the annexed regions of Austria and the Sudetenland and the subjugated protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia during the run-up to World War II. Once more, the now defunct Dresdner Bank was in the vanguard, gobbling up the lion's share of available financial subsidiaries and serving as the agent of corporations that belonged to the Nazi state, such as the Reichswerke Hermann Göring, or cultivated particularly close ties to it, including Mannesmann Steel. But now, even firms that largely had refrained from takeovers within the Reich, such as IG Farben and Schering, plunged in as a means of beating out competitors. The acquirers consistently regarded it as literally none of their business that the Nazi state then generally stripped the former owners of most of the sales proceeds, however meager. Given this record, by the time World War II began, corporations, like virtually all other German institutions, were virtually pre-programmed to participate in future Nazi crimes. In fact, most of them already were so implicated in plunder and persecution that there was no turning back. Degussa had agreed to smelt the precious metals the Reich extorted from German Jews in 1939. How could it then refuse to do the like for the precious metals German bureaucrats squeezed from the Jews of Łódź in 1940, or even express reservations about purifying the metals that the SS later delivered to the National Bank from camps and shooting sites in occupied Poland and farther east? The Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbanks had brokered and been party to numerous property transfers in Germany and served as transmission belts that collected, monetized, and steadily transferred Jews' wealth to the German state or to accounts that the Gestapo controlled in 1939 to 41. On what basis, then, would these institutions and their affiliates in occupied countries shun similar activities or cease to perform them once deportation began? Leading German manufacturers had pursued Jewish-owned enterprises in Austria, the Sudetenland, and the Czech provinces, especially prospective competitors and or former business partners. Why would these enterprises then refrain from tempting acquisitions in the expanding German sphere? Allianz had begun insuring SS-owned factories at Dachau, and Degussa's Degesch subsidiary had started supplying Sachsenhausen with Zyklon to fumigate clothing in 1940. Why should they withhold these services from new camps farther east later? With the power and wealth of Himmler's SS obviously on the rise in wartime, the benefits of good working relations with its leadership were too great to forego for firms or individual executives jockeying for advantage, and the risks of poor ties were too great to assume. As a result, while first German rhetoric and then German actions turned toward annihilation as the final solution to the Jewish question, the extent of German corporate participation in the escalating criminality became largely a functioning of what the government asked for. When and where it permitted or called for significant corporate involvement, the competitive advantages of ambitions of senior executives and their enterprises generally guaranteed that they would help. When and where the regime saw reason to restrain these ambitions, the role of German big business in the Holocaust proved less than many large German firms wished. Contrary to popular perception, corporate takeovers of Jewish-owned property in occupied countries were one of the spheres in which the acquisitive ambitions of big German firms were often disappointed. But when the SS asked, corporations treated it as a fitting business partner and became willing enablers of the Holocaust. The large commercial banks and their subsidiaries in occupied regions extended lines of credit to the SS and its offshoots and accepted massive stolen deposits from them, which consisted almost entirely of sums extorted or plundered from Jews before or during their deportation. In Prague, the largest single depositor to the Dresdner Bank's affiliate was the SS Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which confiscated most of the assets of Czech Jewry. At the Deutsche Bank's subsidiary in the same city, the largest depositor was the Jewish administration of the Theresienstadt transferred ghetto. This is a picture of that from the air and on a street scene there, to which privileged German Jews had to assign their assets before being allowed to spend a short time in this way station on the road to death. In Krakow, about half of the cash proceeds of Operation Reinhardt, the pillaging and murder of Polish Jewry, landed in the vaults of the Dresdner Bank subsidiary. Along with the banks, Germany's leading precious metals processors and insurance firms actively sought out the SS's business. Determined to preserve its market leadership, Degussa unquestionably accepted various forms of gold gathered by the SS, especially from the occupied East and the Netherlands, and refined it into some 5 metric tons of pure and fungible gold, some of which the banks then sold at a substantial profit on the open market in Istanbul. Allianz Insurance agreed to cover the shipments in both directions, from the SS to Degussa and from it to the banks and then to Turkey. Instrumental in turning Jews' assets to the Nazi state's advantage, large German firms were also vital to the realization of the largest and most murderous death camp, namely Auschwitz. In fact, the place might never have acquired that dreadful status, but for 2 related decisions on the part of I.G. Farben's leaders in early 1941. First, to build a giant synthetic fuel and rubber factory 7 kilometers east of the camp at a place called Monowitz. This is a picture of the factory in the middle of 1944. And secondly, to trade building materials destined for that project to the SS in return for gravel and laborers from the small concentration camp then used only for Polish political prisoners. The first decision created an appetite for labor that alerted Himmler to revenue-generating possibilities in the region. The second decision allowed the SS to add an extra level to nearly all of the pre-existing barracks that constituted the fledgling concentration camp. This is an example of the barracks that originally had only 2 stories, and the I.G. Farben material enabled the addition of a third, and thus enabled the expansion of the camp. When plans emerged later in that year to build a companion camp at Birkenau, then early in 1942 to construct 4 large buildings that containing gas chambers and crematoria there, the construction firm selected was one in which the Dresdner Bank was the biggest shareholder and lender. AEG, a company founded and for a long time led by members of the Jewish Rathenau family, provided the electric circuitry. Once again, Allianz extended coverage for the workshops at the original camp and the Farben factory. The Deutsche Bank's branch at Katowice loaned the SS 2 million Reichsmarks, mostly for building at Birkenau, and an equal sum to Farben for its construction project on the big factory. Having helped to bring Auschwitz-Birkenau to life, I.G. Farben also aided the camp in producing death. The giant chemicals combine was a part owner, albeit in a secondary capacity to its partner Degussa, in a company called Degesch. It controlled the production of Zyklon, which you see a can of that on the screen. Zyklon was a vaporizing pesticide that in 1941 became the principal murder weapon at Auschwitz-Birkenau. No known evidence establishes that the representatives of Farben on the board of Degesch knew of the use of their product for gassing. But the business manager of that firm, who was on Degussa's payroll, and the principal owner of the firm that actually sold the Zyklon to the SS, both certainly did know, and they chose to continue delivering the substance. Farben's second connection to the death toll at Auschwitz was more demonstrable and direct. It involved supplying SS doctors at Auschwitz and other concentration camps with sulfa drugs and vaccines designed to combat dysentery, gonorrhea, tuberculosis, and typhus. These were then tested for efficacy and tolerability on inmates. In some of these experiments, half of the prisoners treated as guinea pigs died, but the total number of victims is unknown. Still, a third way in which Farben contributed to the mortality rate at Auschwitz was the firm's exploitation of thousands of inmate slave laborers at its nearby factory and coal mines. The best estimates of the death toll vary between 13,000 and 28,000 prior to the evacuation of the site in January 1945. By that time, the practice of putting camp prisoners to work in German industry had become widespread, including more than 700,000 people spread among enterprises deemed vital to the German war effort. Farben's deal with Auschwitz for labor in early 1941 actually blazed a trail in that regard. Until then, only the construction firm Philip Holtzmann had made extensive use of ghetto or camp inmates. Holtzmann put them to work on building a highway from Berlin to Łódź in 1940. But Farben's agreement with the SS still conformed to the general SS preference for locating factories near camps, not camps near factories. Volkswagen broke that taboo early in 1941 by arguing successfully for establishing a camp at its factory in Wolfsburg for inmates to work building a plant to make aluminum. These arrangements remained unusual until late 1943, when Albert Speer, the armaments minister, and Heinrich Himmler of the SS concluded that the Reich's labor shortage was so acute that Jewish camp inmates had to be put to work in multiple German factories, along with numerous non-Jews that were being rounded up from across occupied Europe. Most industrial leaders gratefully accepted the workers thus offered, concluding that they were indispensable to maintaining or increasing output, given the massive military call-ups of industrial workers and the already high rate of German female employment. The tunnel vision that pervaded industrial participation in the Holocaust especially characterized the readiness of German industry to exploit inmate labor during World War II. It amounted to a willingness to walk over corpses, as the German equivalent to the phrase, to stop at nothing, goes. For the employment of inmate labor occurred on terms that contained perverse incentives. The SS charged a fee per inmate per day that in many cases exceeded what a German civilian laborer, especially a construction worker, would have been paid. Even when this was not the case, the relatively low productivity of inexperienced inmates offset any savings on compensation. As a result, employers sought to economize on food and housing, to drive prisoners excessively hard, and to work them long hours, at least so long as replacements were available for those who fell by the wayside. In other words, the use of so-called slave laborers became a process in which firms and their leaders reduced camp inmates to the status of a factor of production that could be used up like so many pieces of coal. Of the 1.1 million camp inmates put to work, about half for government projects like building the bunkers along the Atlantic coast and the underground factories like those that made V-2 rockets, and about half for firms that produced arms and vital materials. 500 to 600,000 perished. Participation in this crazed process, including in the massive effort in 1944-45 to bury factories underground in order to save equipment and production lines from bombing, was fostered by executives' real fears of ouster, arrest, and execution. In 1942 alone, Paul Reusch was forced out of the leadership at MAN, as well as Ernst Pünsken of that at United Steel, while the regime also succeeded in removing or disempowering all the top executives of the nation's 5 leading aircraft firms. A number of prominent business people were actually executed for having said indiscreet things about the Nazi leadership or the Nazi chances in the war. Here are a picture of one of them, George Miethe of the Deutsche Bank on the left. This man, Wilhelm Ricken, was the head of the Rhinisch-Westphalian electricity company. He was executed, as it says here, on the 2nd of May, 1944, because he had predicted Germany's defeat in the war. Miethe, the man here, was made an example of in the Nazi newspaper. This is what can happen to you if you say bad things about the Führer. Rudolf Blom, this man was had given his family's name to one of the principal wharf, so shipbuilding companies in Germany. He was tried for sabotage at the end of 1944 because he hadn't met production targets. Throughout the descent of German corporate conduct, from the abandonment of Jewish colleagues in 1933 through profiting off Jews' dispossession and murder to working Jews to death, the leading executives embodied the thoughtlessness, the indifference to the people on the receiving end of their deeds that Hannah Arendt defined as the banality of evil. Indeed, they embodied it far more accurately than the sort of man to which she applied the term, Adolf Eichmann, who both disregarded and relished the effects of his actions on others, because he profoundly believed in what he was doing. At the center of corporate complicity was mundane and myopic dedication to short-term self-interest, whether defined as monetary returns, personal advancement, or individual and corporate survival. As Raoul Hilberg, one of the pioneers of Holocaust studies, observed, in most German organizations throughout the Holocaust, quote, normal procedures were employed as if extreme decisions were not being made, unquote. The main impetus behind this ethical numbness was a relentless focus on oneself and one's own blinkered priorities. So what's the point of this long story? Refusing to defend people as a group can lead to persecuting them as such once the haters acquire power and the capacity to mold human self-interest, including firms' self-interests, to their purposes. And once this process gathers momentum, it is far harder to stop than to accept, far harder to reject the justifications than to begin to echo them. The results were catastrophic, especially for Jews, but also for the other Germans. And they were not, however, on the whole, catastrophic for the people I've referred to so far. Now, I want to stop here because I've talked fully 50 minutes. I want to leave some room for your questions. The balance of what I was going to say had to do with how these corporations evaded punishment after the war, and then largely blocked access to the sources that would have permitted me to write this book 40 years ago, and only now have made this kind of book possible. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. That was extremely thoughtful and sobering. Obviously, given your background, we'd expect nothing less. There are a number of questions in the queue in the hands. Mike and Alex, I'm going to take a few questions from the queue and then I'll go to you. Cornelia, would you be willing to elaborate on your references regarding female employment?
Yes, there's a kind of myth that has circulated in the history of Nazi Germany that women were coddled under the Third Reich, and that therefore they were not adequately mobilized for the war effort. This is utterly untrue. There were a larger percentage of women in the German workforce were already involved in German industry in 1939 than ever became the case in Britain or the United States. So did I say that clearly enough? Before there was Rosie the Riveter, there was Helga die Nieterin. And there were more Helgas than there ever were Rosies. Mm. So the mobilization of German women had gone really quite far by 1940. And the elasticity of the female labor force was therefore limited. And what the Nazis saw themselves presented with was, okay, they could try to force the last remaining women into the workforce, but that might undermine morale of soldiers at the front. And they drew back from that. And then they said, well, what do we do? Do we export production to the occupied countries, or do we import the workers from the occupied countries to us? And many German business leaders, as well as the leaders of German economic administration, preferred to import the workers rather than export the production. So that's how that unfolded.
Nice. Rose asked, what percentage of German businesses were Jewish owned or managed?
Well, owned or managed is very hard to estimate. I've tried to figure this out, but I couldn't really do it because a substantial proportion of German big businesses were publicly traded. they're held by stockholders,
Yeah.
and the percentage of stockholders who were Jewish was even hard for the Nazis to figure out afterwards, let alone for anybody before the Nazis came in 1933 to figure it out. But so what I used as a proxy for that was those figures about directors,
Yeah.
and as I outlined, it's a shrinking minority before 1933.
Tom asks, I think you just referenced this, what changed to allow you to write this book now relative to 40 years ago? Any new sources that became available?
All of the archives opened up in the 1990s, and I had personal experience with a lot of archives that blocked. The Dresdner Bank lied to me on at least two occasions and basically said, we don't have anything. And then in the late 90s, around 1998, because they were subjected to class action suits in the United States that might have led to them having to pay money in American courts for what they had done back in the day, they decided to ask a group of German historians to write their history. They then brought these German historians to an air raid bunker in Berlin, where all of their records from the Nazi era were stored. They had never cataloged those records, so they basically said to the historians, "Here you go, sort this out, and you can write it, and you can write the history based on these records." It took them 2 years to just organize the archive, but it existed, and they had told me twice that it didn't exist. Henkel of Dusseldorf is a large family-owned company, exists to this day, still makes the most prominent detergent in Germany, which is called Persil. Henkel.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Sorry, what was that? I didn't hear. That might something here went off.
Yeah, you might have triggered Google or Siri.
I don't know what I did, but anyway, Henkel would not let me into their archive, even though I was writing a book about Degussa, and Henkel and Degussa had entwined stock ownerships in the 1930s and 40s. So you get a sense of what the blockade was. All of these companies have now opened up. There's a history of Henkel that's coming out in January. Every one of these companies has decided to make a clean breast of things. But of course, they're doing that for the same reason that they didn't for many years, which is it's good PR now to say we're just as shocked as you are. But in the 1960s and 70s, they thought it was bad PR. And so they concealed everything.
You sort of anticipated there were a number of questions around how transparent have the businesses become over time, and do you still think there's more archives that will be coming online or that would
There will surely be more things that come online. The most sensational revelation of the last few years is about 5 years old. A family who lived in North Rhine-Westphalia opened a trunk in their attic, and they found pictures of the Sobibor death camp, which is a camp that we have almost no photographic evidence of. Not pictures of the killing operations, but pictures of what the SS men at their leisure were doing and the overall layout of the camp and so forth. And they did this because, a grandfather had been in the SS garrison and sent the pictures home, and they were sitting in the trunk all these years. So more and more of that will come out. There will be more companies that decide to tell their story. But the overall pattern of the record is now clear, I think.
One follow-up, and then Alex and Mike, I'll go to you. Christina asks a broader question. How do you view the decision to close, I guess, the Maryland College Park archives unless one proves one credentials? Do you have an opinion on that?
I don't. I've been out of the country for the last 3 weeks, so if this is really new, I don't know. I hadn't heard that the National Archives at College Park is closed. It's closed to all researchers, or is this part of the?
Unless you have credentials. I'm sorry, I'm not
Yeah,
specifics, but it sounds like limiting access.
Yeah, I don't know what's behind that. I, we're generally experiencing difficulties with holding the government accountable on a host of issues, and this may be related to that. I just don't know.
Okay, Alex, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. You guys hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, again, thanks. Yeah, again, great talk. But I want to ask, you didn't really mention it. about the boycott of the Nazi economy that started in April 1933, which was, pretty serious. I mean, even the Catholic Archbishop of Liverpool was, telling his worshippers not to, and there was a huge march in London with 50,000 people and the Trade Union Congress. And as I understand it, it had a very, at least for some months, a very severe consequence for, because again, it was, international, but, largely in Europe. And some people argue, I think, that it even kind of brought the German economy to the verge of collapse. So I just wonder what your research showed on that, and also again how
Yeah.
the
I
Nazis saw it and responded. Thanks.
I don't know who argues that it almost brought the German economy to its collapse. The problem with boycotting the Nazis was that the Nazis weren't greatly interested in international trade. And
Right.
and they were always short of foreign exchange, but they found they did a lot of barter deals with Eastern European states so that they didn't actually have to use dollars or gold to buy things. They exported German machinery to pay for oil from Romania and things like that. So boycotting exports was, it was not the right instrument to get at the Nazis, because the Nazis were striving for economic self-sufficiency.
Right.
And in the early years, like as you said, 34, this is when they were most vulnerable. But Schacht was still the economics minister, and he was brilliant at workarounds. He found so many ways of sustaining what the imports they needed, and without having to export goods to pay for them. So it didn't have a lot of effect. There were moments when the German economy was so overstretched that anything was a problem for them, but it was a shortage economy from beginning to end. So I don't think the boycotts had a lot of effect. American companies certainly found ways of working around them.
Right.
Thanks a lot, Alex.
Thanks.
Mike, if you want to unmute your line, I think you're good.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. First of all, it was great talk. You made a great case, and the analogies to the present time were particularly clear. But I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first of which is that the question is, did German industries did the industries producing, for instance, munitions, tanks, aircraft, or whatever, did they, shall we say, fiddle with the book, so to speak, in the sense of producing to meet quotas, producing whatever it is, tanks, planes, that were not up to standard or were not even complete, but just to keep the numbers correct, just to appease the regime and to make sure they were producing enough, even though they were not, shall we say, lack of a better term, usable. They were not.
In the war, the answer to that is yes, but the regime put them in that position, because the regime went over to a policy of quantity over quality. Roughly 1942 is when they begin insisting on this. And they know that their aircraft, for instance, are not equal to Allied aircraft. They had learned that in the Battle of Britain, but they desperately needed to generate enough planes to even put up any kind of fight. So what happens is they insist that the aircraft companies stop tinkering with improvements to the production line, just turn the stuff out. And this is, of course, a self-defeating operation. Now, in some cases, tanks, the improvement in quality that the companies achieve is pretty amazing, but they achieve it on a kind of giantism effect. That is, they achieve tanks that are better than Allied tanks, but they take up so much material that Germany is short of that you can't generate volume with those. You follow me? So,
Yes.
so what happens is German armaments, one way or another, constantly fall behind the Allies from 1942 on. And what, I mean, most economic historians will argue that the Germans could never have won the war unless they had developed an atomic bomb, and they didn't.
Right. And I'm sure the Allied bombings had uh, put additional
Tremendous,
massive. Yeah.
tremendous. Yeah. I mean,
And
one thing that we always forget about the Allied bombings is in 1944, 50% of German artillery was pointed up.
yeah. And also their industry was going down,
Right.
and they had to
Right.
deal with that. But the the next question, it's really there. It's a couple of questions, but they're all interrelated to one theme, which will lead you to be able to talk about what you didn't get to talk about. The there were stories, rumors perhaps, that reparations were paid after the war to companies, that corporations who suffered under the Allied bombings. In other words, they were paid by the Allied powers reparations for the damage done to their factories in certain cases. And that also leads to the fact, to the other question, the big question, which is not just in prosecution of these firms, as far as reparations, how did the German companies, what happened with these corporations as far as both prosecutions and reparations that they would have to.
Sure. The first part of the question, the only case I know of companies being paid for war damages in the form of reparations, that is paid by one of the Allies, is American companies in Germany. Ford and Opel got money for the destruction of their plants in Germany by the American and the British Air Forces. So they did get some payment of war damages by the US. Now, German companies routinely got, during the war, payments for war damages from the Nazi state. So that was a regular thing. The Allies hit the plant in March 44. You put in a report to the financial ministry in Germany, and it assessed the damage and paid you an amount for you to rebuild those factories. So they all got money along the way. Now, after the war, the restitution is a really hit or miss thing. There are some German companies that decide to make what they always say is a moral gesture. And they make some payments to slave laborers who worked for them. In the early 50s, Volkswagen, Rheinmetall, IG Farben, I think maybe Siemens also, made voluntary payments to former concentration camp inmates who had worked for them. But these were token, I mean, the biggest payment was $1,500 in 1955, I think. It's very small amounts. And it's very small sectors of the exploited people who get access to that money. Over subsequent decades, there are some more payments like this, but nothing on a global scale until 1999, 2000, when German industry creates a foundation for memory, something in the future, and the Germans collect 5 billion Deutschmarks from the participating companies and 5 billion Deutschmarks from the German government. So that's 10 billion Deutschmarks, which is 5.1 billion euros. And that money is distributed in the early aughts of this century to the small subsector of slave laborers and forced laborers that is still alive. Everybody who died before then generally got nothing. And so that's how it worked. The story is slightly more complicated because there were some international agreements between, say, the Netherlands and Germany, where payments were made to the Netherlands, and the Netherlands then made payments to people who had been exploited. But the overall pattern is German industry blamed everything on the state and said, you have to take that up with the German government, not us. And then in 1999, 2000, that pattern broke. But by then, when it broke, there was a very small subset of affected people still alive.
But as far as the for the Holocaust itself, um, payments to uh, individual Jews, Jewish families, Jewish organizations, etc. Did the corporations, shall we say, step up to the plate on that one?
No, in the early 50s, there was an agreement with the state of Israel that between West Germany and the state of Israel that involved a substantial payment. I'm not sure I remember this rightly right off the bat, but I think it's about 500 million Deutschmarks. That is paid to the Israeli state, which then distributes it to people who have some claim. There was also there's also a payment to the Jewish Claims Conference in the early 1950s, partly from corporations, partly from the German state. So, but these are relatively small compared to the scale of the damage done.
Right, right. And now I'll just open it up. So I'll ask the question. And to how were they prosecuted, if they were prosecuted, and to what extent?
Well, we put a bunch of these people on trial after the war. We put the chief executives of IG Farben, the chief executives of Krupp, two of the leading bankers of the Dresdner Bank, the head of the Reichswerke, Hermann Göring. The French put Hermann Röchling on trial, who was a big steel magnate, and so forth. If you calculate by the charges, a minority of them were convicted. If you calculate by the number of people who were charged with something, a majority of them were convicted. But the bottom line is nobody served more than 6 years. So even the people who were instrumental in organizing the IG Farben factory at Auschwitz were out by 1951. There are some successes here. The guy who was in charge of selling the Zyklon to the SS, you may not remember the picture I showed you, but I'll show you quickly again. You'll see on this can, you see that name, Tesch & Stabenow? That's the factory, that's the company that sold the Zyklon to the SS. Bruno Tesch was executed by the British after the war. His company was based in Hamburg. Hamburg was in the British zone. They put him on trial along with one of his chief assistants. They convicted them both and they shot them. But that's a rare example. Almost all of these people, the corporate people, get off pretty free. They have times of fearfulness in 45, 46, 47, but by the time the trials are over, for the most part, they've gotten light sentences and they're all out by 51.
And the corporations themselves, it's difficult to prosecute a corporation. But the corporation,
IG Farben gets split up into three pieces. It's Bayer, BASF, and what then was called Höchst, which has now been bought up by other people and doesn't have that name anymore. The banks were split up for about 10 years. By 1955, however, the Deutsche and the Dresdner and the Commerzbanks were all back together again. There were, the Reichswerke Hermann Göring was a government-owned company, and that was smashed and distributed. Krupp was supposed to be sold off when not the old man who had directed the company until 1943, he was not put on trial because he was ruled incapable of defending himself, but his son was put on trial. And the verdict was that the company had to be sold, but no buyer emerged. No German company would bid on the pieces. No foreign company apparently stepped up to it. And so by 1952, John McCloy, the man in charge of the American occupation, just let that verdict drop. And so Krupp was never sold. And the man who had been convicted, who was then released in 51, he then got all his property back by the mid-50s.
Well, thank you very much for a very important talk and book. And thanks very much. Yes.
Glad to help. Glad to do it.
Thank you, Michael. Peter, I know we're over the clock and there are a number of questions in the queue. Do you mind taking maybe one more?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Mark, I know you've had your hand raised. If you want to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is very interesting. You mentioned Turkey and that the Turks allowed what was the SS, I believe, to sell a certain amount of gold. Sweden and Switzerland tend to get a lot of flack for their economic cooperation with the German with Nazi Germany during the war. To what level? I mean, could you describe Turkey's role and have they escaped criticism?
You know, it's
Or
so
what?
it's
What's that?
it's
What's the
so
take?
ambiguous because on the one hand, Turkish universities were one of the great places of refuge for German Jewish scholars in the 1930s. As part of the modernization drive that Ataturk had set in motion and so forth, he wanted to have westernized universities and so forth. And these German Jewish professor refugees find positions in Turkey on a far greater scale than they find in the United States or Great Britain. And so on the one hand, there's this positive story. On the other hand, the Turks had a historic alliance with Germany in World War I. They had connections that went back a long time. They tried to preserve neutrality. And so they kind of cozied up to the Nazis. Now, the thing about the gold, however, is that's it's not really a government story. What the Turks allow the German banks in Turkey to do is sell gold on the open market. They don't ask questions about the origin of the gold. And because the Turkish economy is experiencing considerable inflation during the war years, there's a hot market for gold. And the Turks don't want to crack down on that because that's obviously letting off a little steam in the economy. Rich people who want to put their assets in gold will be angry if they can't, but they won't be angry if they can. And so as a domestic political situation, they let it go. So that's the story. Now, they're not nearly, the Swiss story is terrible almost from beginning to end. And at the tail end of the war, the Swiss know that a lot of the gold that is coming into their country from Germany is stolen and corrupt, and they don't care. They are in correspondence with the head of the Reichsbank, the German National Bank. The Germans are trying to conceal the origin of this, but the Swiss know that a lot of this gold is plundered. Incidentally, 90% of the plundered gold that the Germans took was not from Jews. It was from the national treasuries of places like the Netherlands and so forth. But 10% of it was from Jews, and the Swiss couldn't have cared less. The Swedish story is a little better because when the Germans start to round up the Norwegian Jews at the end of 1941, the Swiss suddenly see the Swedes suddenly see some solidarity. And they haven't cared about what's happening to Jews in German occupied areas until it's Scandinavian Jews that are being affected. And they open the border to the Norwegian Jews. And this is the beginning of a complete reversal in Swedish policy, where they become protectors later of the Danish Jews and make it possible for the Danes to get across the water to Sweden. Then Wallenberg is in Hungary, and long before he gets to Hungary in 1944, the head of the Swedish legation in Hungary has been issuing passes to protect people and so forth. So the Swedish story switches in the middle of the war. The Swiss story never switches. The Turkish story is always ambiguous.
Great. Thanks for the question, Mark. And Peter, thank you for a fantastic talk. Again, the book is Profits and Persecution, German Big Business and the Third Reich by Peter Hayes. Please join us this Tuesday, October 7th at 8 p.m. when David and Margaret White will discuss their book, Wings of War, the World War II fighter plane that saved the Allies and the believers who made it fly, which tells the remarkable story behind the rise of the P-51 Mustang, the World War II fighter plane that destroyed the Luftwaffe and made D-Day possible. Hopefully you can join us. Until then, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And Peter, thank you very much for your time and a great
My
talk.
pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Yes.